As we get started this morning, I want to ask you a question, and it's not a hypothetical question. In real life, I want you to raise your hand if you're joining us by Zoom or whatever our platform is, and wherever our camera is. You can gesture to one another, or you can find some other way to let us know later. But I want to ask you this question, so please, hands up high, loud and proud. How many of you have recently lost trust in an institution that once felt solid and reliable? Look around. It's a full house, right? And I realize the irony of talking about this during stewardship season, so I'll tie it in. It works. It comes together. But we have this sense, don't we? And we're not alone, because according to the most recent Gallup polling on the issue, people feel deeply disillusioned with the systems they once counted on. And I won't speak too much to current events, but I'm interested to see where those numbers go in the next few months as they do more polling. Just to share some of the broad scope of this with you, I wanted to break it up into three big chunks. We've got the ones that had trust, the institutions that had trust and more or less kept it over the course of 20 years. And then it goes bad from there, basically. Everybody else was 36% or lower net trust. 36% lower or net trust. And among that group, it breaks down into consistent level of mistrust, which means we didn't like them 20 years ago and we still don't, and then big loss of trust. Institutions that dropped 20% or more from already low ratings in the last 20 years. So just to run through that real quick, there was one bright point, and this is where I felt enlivened in a way. We have remarkable and abounding new trust for small businesses. Small businesses. Small business trust went up from 57% 20 years ago to 68%. And this might be a good tie-in for West Concord Union Church in that we, in a lot of ways, feel like a smaller business rather than a big corporation. We do have a sale. Yeah, you can get your stuff here. Hyper-local, mom and pop shop, right? So we have new trust, small businesses, and a little bit of a savior, hopefully, for this sermon. Then there was consistent, pretty high trust, and that was with the military and the police, which I felt kind of complicated as I was thinking about that. Military went from 66% approval to 61% over the course of 20 years. The police, likewise, 57% to 51%. And that's where we have relative trust as a society. Let that read what it will. And then it drops off. All of the following are 36% or lower today. As I was saying, we didn't trust them 20 years ago, and we don't today. And those break out relative, around 40s rating was the medical system writ large, public schools, around about the 30% approval rating, criminal justice system, and big business bottomed out at 20%. And big business especially is now at 16%. And then the piece de resistance, the big drop, the ones we used to have lots of trust in and now don't have much. That was higher ed, the presidency, TV news coming at 12% approval rating, Congress, even worse off, 9%. Only 9% of us have relative confidence in Congress. Big banks, the Supreme Court, and finally the American church, which is the wah-wah-wah. Makes me sad. We went from 60% relative approval 20 years ago to just over 30% today. Now, when you zoom in specifically on that, people tend to have kind of conflicting answers. They will really like and have relative confidence in their local church if they go to church. But when asked about the American church writ large, that's where things kind of come apart. And I see some nodding heads. I wonder if some of us feel similarly, that we really identify with our local place, but when you ask us about the big picture, we're not so sure. And we're not so sure because we've seen what local history has kind of played out, recent history rather than local. The headlines are filled with scandals and broken promises and betrayals by those in power. And I think you feel it. You feel it, that sinking feeling in your stomach that the structures meant to support and to guide you just might be crumbling. We see this erosion of trust just about everywhere. Like I said, in politics, people feel polarized and let down. In corporations, people feel exploited. And yes, even in the church, there are some people walking away saying, this just isn't for me anymore. It's as if we're standing at the edge, looking up at the temple, something we thought was indestructible, only to hear a voice saying, it's all coming down. And I don't know about you, but that can just feel pretty darn scary. And in the last couple weeks, that has just been really on me everywhere I look. But I think there's hope here for us, because it is just at this moment in Mark's gospel that Jesus steps in. And even if you listen to his words, it doesn't immediately sound all things bright and beautiful necessarily, does it? He foretells the destruction of the temple, actually. But I think he does so in a way that speaks to us and can speak hope to our situation. We have ears to hear it. So let's dig in to the text. The disciples were simply awestruck by the grandeur of that building. You can kind of tell. They're marveling at its stature, beauty of the thing. And Jesus sees this. He sees this, but I think he sees something else too. Because he tells them plainly, you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. And I think, in a way, this is a kind of stark reminder that these things we tend to treat as immortal, like institutions and even buildings and structures, our comfort zones, they're all temporary. They serve a purpose, and they serve a good purpose, but they may not hold the security we imagine. And in the context of Mark's gospel, Jesus' prophecy about the temple wasn't about architecture. It was a symbol of shifting spiritual priorities for the community. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't really just a religious center. It also was a symbol of ethnic pride, of power and identity. And for the disciples and the people of Israel, it also represented stability. Stability under the occupation of the Roman Empire. That was their one soft place to land in a world that was set against them. It was their one place where they could reliably connect with God's presence. Jesus saw this, and I think he probably honored it. But he knew something that the disciples might not have fully grasped. That structures, even these sacred, really valuable ones, are not the only way that God works in the world. Biblical scholars point out that Jesus' reference here to the abomination of desolation echoes prophecies in the book of Daniel that was written about 200 years earlier. And if you're a lectionary nerd, you will know that today there was a reading that was suggested from Daniel to pair with this gospel reading from Mark. That book of Daniel describes calamity and the desecration of holy spaces. Temple's fall would have been viewed as a real disaster, but it wasn't exactly unprecedented. Again, Daniel, writing 200 years earlier, wrote about it. And as we'll see, there was another fall of another temple in Israel's history. This sign, this destruction, was recognizable, in other words. And in the historical context, the destruction of the temple in AD 70, right after Jesus was writing and speaking, it was an existential crisis for the Jewish people. There was civil unrest in response to really poor conditions from the Romans, and it had already happened in Jesus' day, but it really swelled up. It was an all-out revolt by about 40 years later. So when Jesus, if he made this prediction historically, says that the temple's going to fall, he's actually right, and it happens right about 40 years later. The Romans came in, they looted the temple, they burnt everything that was left, then they knocked down all the stones and ground them into rubble to use for road gravel and other construction projects. Pretty desecrated, right? The message was clear. There was zero respect. They had reasserted control over Judea through abject domination, and this marked the end of Jewish quasi-autonomy in the region. This was horrific. This was terrible, but it wasn't unprecedented, because the Babylonians had done the exact same thing to Solomon's temple during the siege of Jerusalem about 600 years before that. Terrible, right? This second destruction forced the Jewish people in their own time to reimagine what faith could look like without that central physical structure that they had come to know. But it wasn't the first time that they had had to do this. Before, they had put ritual sacrifice at the center of Jewish practice in the temple. Now, after the destruction of the temple, that center had to move out into the synagogues, and thus was born the rabbinic Judaism that we know today, which emphasizes prayer and ethical living and interpretation of the Torah as the core practices of the faith. The role of the temple is still something that's debated. If you plug into the news, you'll see some of those stakes. But rabbinic Judaism, the kind we encounter in our own neighborhoods today, is dispersed in a way. It's more textual as a tradition. And what this means for us is that contrary to what we may have been told growing up, what we now call Judaism and what we now call Christianity actually emerged alongside of and in conversation with each other following the destruction of the Second Temple. In other words, we were both born as movements from a shared trauma point. And from a scholarly perspective, for that reason, at least in our early years, we are much more like sister movements in a shared tradition than we are like two distinct religions. And so when you really inhabit this, it stops making sense to think of Christianity as picking up where Judaism left off, since again, we both come from a common historical moment. And for me, in my practice, that's also why you'll hear me refer to our shared texts as readings from the Hebrew Bible and our distinct sacred texts as readings from the Christian Testament. I think phrasings like Old and New Testament or First and Second Testament kind of confuse the issue because, again, we emerge from a common moment. So it's a lot of interesting history for some of us, some boring history for others of us. But what does it mean? Darn it, how is that relevant to me today? Why should I care? Well, I think to sum it up, you wouldn't have what we now call Christianity or Judaism without the destruction of the Second Temple. The birth of these new things came out of the tragic end of what had come before. And folks, if you're paying attention, I think you'll find that this is actually very relevant to us today. Because our temples are falling, aren't they? We are losing confidence in the stability of our institutions, left and right. As that Gallup poll made clear, we have 32% trust in the American church, 30% trust in the Supreme Court, 26% trust in the presidency, 9% trust in Congress. Our temples are falling. And here's where that gets even more challenging for us, because in our attempt to cope with that loss, we've retreated into in-group thinking, haven't we? We tend to find comfort in herding up with those who look and think and believe just like we do, and then contrasting ourselves to everybody else. It's profound, I think, what Jesus offers as an alternative in this text. And that, I think, is the reason that it is so relevant for us today. Because Jesus is calling us to a much steadier hope that's centered in trust of God rather than trust in a physical space. Trust in God rather than trust in an institution. Trust in God even more than trust in our in-group. Mark's gospel was indeed written to a community living through the trauma of the temple's destruction. And they were forced to ask themselves this question: what does it mean to follow Jesus in a world that is falling apart? And the answer, I think in part, is to engage prophetically. To engage prophetically. Now I have to say what I don't mean and be careful here. How many of us grew up thinking about prophecy as fortune telling? More or less, something like that, right? Prophecy is when you can say an event's going to happen and then it comes to pass in history, right? That is one way of thinking about prophecy. And in an uncanny way, Jesus seems to have said something true about the future maybe before it happened, although that's debated by scholars. So that's one way of thinking about prophecy, but what I'm talking about is something different. If you've heard me preach on this before, you'll probably be tired of the phrasing. But I think for us, prophecy might be more about adopting a God-centered approach to making meaning the present rather than a way of predicting the future. A God-centered approach to making meaning of the present. Because as I hear him speak, Jesus is not telling us that every institution needs to fall. I don't hear him saying that God is destroying our country because of its unfaithfulness. And when the disciples really press on Jesus to get specific about the plans and why things are happening, when exactly stuff is happening, you'll notice he kind of pivots. He doesn't give them a lot of clarity. He goes back to Daniel. He goes back to his Bible and back to the sacred texts that helped them think about what was happening. And I think in a way that can soften the language for us, right? Because it almost seems like Jesus amps up the anxiety in the passage, right? He's talking about times of war and people who are going to lie and all this crazy stuff. But if you read it through the lens of Daniel, you know he's actually taking people back to their sacred texts. He's inviting them to read with an eye toward their present situation and find trust of God in the midst of that, even though it sounds kind of scary as he does so. Again, what I hear Jesus doing here is inviting us to see our situation through the eyes of faith. Now, as children of the liberal Christian tradition, we've come to proclaim that prophecy, again, is not really about telling the future. It's also not about doom and gloom for us normally. But it is, I think, about discerning what God is midwifing in the midst of our collapse. As we see institutions we trusted faltering, we can be in a place of despair if we're not careful. But I think the alternative that Jesus invites us to is something else. He's almost whispering in our ears, something else is being born here. Can you see it? Can you trust it? Our unique contributions as our kind of Christian, I think, is that radical assertion. That God's presence isn't confined to any one building or institution or liturgical form, or even, frankly, one religion. Our hope isn't in the endurance of human-made structures, even ones we really like the concept of Christianity. Our hope is in God's ongoing work in the world. The fall of the temple, as terrifying as it is also an invitation to embrace reality and look for God in new spaces, new relationships, and new experiences. With the little UCC logo on it, right? God is still speaking. God is still speaking. So what does that mean for us practically? Really, on the ground practically. I think it means that we have to prepare ourselves to shake loose the constraints and the constrictions of how we've always done things. I think we'll need to make room for the Spirit in our own personal lives in fresh ways. We might need to adopt the posture of a spiritual seeker in our own spiritual lives, to our own spiritual formation and discipleship, beyond just showing up for church programming. It means we might need to pursue the common good outside and beyond partisan politics. And if you want something even more specific, I'll invite you to pull out your phone if you want, or take a piece of paper and a pencil. I'm waiting. I don't see people reacting. Pull it out. Something to write with. Grab your phone. And visit Homes for All Mass. Homes for All Mass, M-A-S-S, that's all one word, .org. homesforallmass.org. And go to the Take Action page and consider doing what it says. I realize that that's a bit of a non sequitur, but I really felt moved to give you something hyper-specific that you could walk away this week and do. And if you'll receive the invitation, that's it. homesforallmass.org. Go to the Take Action page and consider doing what it says. It was hard to jimmy that into the sermon because it doesn't exactly fit, and we're not talking about housing, and it's Stewardship Week, and you could give money to the church, and that would be another good thing to do. A lot of good responses, right? But I think it's important that we have that switch here at the end, not just from diagnosing the situation and putting it in the context of Scripture, but to really commit to taking action right here where we are. Because I don't think we're invited to passively wait for the new thing that God's doing. I think what we're being called to is to actively participate ourselves. in building something beyond the rubble, something that reflects God's love and justice in the here and now. So as we face the fall of our temples, let's not cling to the past. Let's not grieve the wrong things. Instead, let's ask, what new thing is God doing right here? And what is my part to play? I know we don't know what the future holds, and I know for a lot of us that's really scary. But I think as Christians, we can trust that God is already there. God is already waiting for us to join in the work of renewal. Let's be courageous enough to follow Jesus to exactly that place. Let's look beyond the fall and into the promise of new life.